Welcome to this continuation of Chapter 2, the concepts in Chapter 2, Biology 160, Introduction to Anatomy and Physiology. In this portion of the lecture, we're going to be talking about chemical reactions, and then we're going to talk about inorganic molecules, particularly water and acids and bases, those sorts of things. In the last section of this chapter, we'll talk about organic molecules. By this time you might be thinking that this chapter is getting a little bit long. There is a lot of information in here. If you were to take a chemistry course, you can take inorganic chemistry, you can take a couple semesters of inorganic chemistry and a couple semesters of organic chemistry to cover all of this stuff in more detail. So there is a lot of information here packed into a short section that could take a couple years to go through if you took individual classes on this information. And if you find this stuff interesting, I encourage you to take some chemistry classes as well. They can be very interesting. So let's move in and talk about the difference here in different chemicals reactions. So chemical reactions are constantly going on all around us, and especially inside our body. So I mentioned a little bit before about digestion is a chemical reaction. All these chemical reactions are what keep us alive. They're part of our metabolism. We can take these chemical reactions and we can break them into different categories. The first one we call a synthesis reaction. Synthesis, if you break down that word, think of synthesize, and it basically means to build something. So some of the chemical reactions in our body are when our body is taking smaller molecules and it's building larger molecules. For example, I have written here glucose being converted to glycogen. Glucose, I'm pretty sure you've heard about some point in your life. That's basically just sugar. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit, because that is an organic molecule. Glycogen you may not be as familiar with, but basically what glycogen is, it's a form of glucose storage. So as you eat foods, your body breaks those foods down into simple sugars called glucose, and then it is absorbed into the body. Your body can then take that glucose and it can hook them together in these long chains called glycogen, and that can be stored in your liver until later when you may need more glucose and your body can break it down. Glycogen is very similar to something called starch, which you most likely have heard about, which is the way that plants store glucose. And in both cases, those are synthesis reactions. We're taking glucose, building it into larger molecules. Then there's also decomposition reactions, and this is the exact opposite. So you could put the example here, when your body takes glycogen from the liver, breaks it down into glucose, and releases that into the bloodstream, that would be a decomposition reaction. Another very important decomposition reaction that goes on constantly inside our body is something called cellular respiration. This is how our body gets energy that we need. The components here, you can see the reaction here. We have glucose. This is the chemical formula for glucose, and you'll see this again, C6H12O6. So it has 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, 6 oxygens. This is a covalently bonded molecule. So the carbons are covalently bonded to the hydrogens and oxygen. This is not an ionic bond. And then we then have oxygen. And it looks like I forgot the O2. Let me fix that. Okay, there we have our O2. So we take glucose and we take oxygen, and the glucose in this reaction is being broken down to CO2. So decomposition, think about something decomposing, it's breaking down. So we have a larger molecule here in glucose being broken down into a smaller molecule, CO2. And what we get out of that is this important molecule here called ATP. And you'll see ATP coming up throughout the semester, because this is a molecule that our body uses to carry out chemical reactions. It gives us the energy. It's basically a kind of a stored energy that allows us to do all those reactions. Alright, finally there's the exchange reaction. And for the exchange reaction, we can bring down ATP here, because it's very important. It's a very important exchange reaction molecule, because ATP can be broken down to ADP and phosphorus, and we'll see how that works later when we talk about energy, digestion, things like that in this semester. When ATP is broken down to ADP and phosphorus, this phosphorus group can be attached to another molecule, whatever it may be. It may even be a glucose molecule. If this phosphorus is attached to another molecule, this is called an exchange reaction. Notice that the phosphorus here, so ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, meaning 3 phosphate groups. ADP is adenosine diphosphate, meaning 2 phosphate groups, and the other phosphate is here. So originally, this phosphate that is broken off was on the ATP. It was broken off and attached to another molecule. That's an exchange reaction. These are different types of reactions that can happen in our body. This leads us to organic versus inorganic compounds. In this lecture, this portion of the lecture, we're just going to focus on inorganic compounds, but I'll take a moment here to tell you the difference between organic and inorganic compounds. An organic molecule or an organic compound is one that contains carbon. Carbon is the key here. And that carbon is bonded to at least one hydrogen. So you may have heard of this idea, heard someone say before, we have carbon-based life. Carbon-based life, it's called carbon-based because we are built of organic compounds. Living things are built of organic compounds, and because they contain carbon, we call that carbon-based life. Organic compounds, most are covalently bonded. So for example, this glucose that we saw just a minute ago, C6H12O6, those 3 atoms there, 3 types of atoms in different numbers, are all covalently bonded together. And that's what we call an organic compound. Inorganic compounds lack carbon. So they're not carbon-based. They're usually simpler compounds. They're often ionically bonded together. Not always though. So the example here, water. Water is a covalently bonded molecule that we talked about before. But other types of inorganic compounds such as NaCl, salt, that's inorganic. Notice there's no carbon there. And this is ionically bonded together. So, we are built of organic compounds. We're living organisms. But inorganic compounds are also very important to us in our body. So let's look at some important inorganic compounds. Water is the first one listed here, and this is a very important compound. Another important type of inorganic compound are salts, such as sodium chloride, and there's many others. And then there's also acids and bases. So we're going to talk a little bit about each of these just briefly and move on.